Meng Haoran, passing the night on Jiande River. Anchor the boat in a mist-heavy cove. Day sinks into dusk, sadness rises. Vast plain, sky-touching treetops, clear river, moon floating just out of reach. So, we continue now with Meng Haoran, who in many aspects is a poet, very congenial with Zhu Yong's spirit, in that, as we've talked a lot of before, Meng Haoran is probably the archetype of the high Tang poet who writes poetry of retirement and of abandoning the world and of describing the landscape, in this competing very closely with Wang Wei. And again, as I think I commented in some previous poems, they both are important landscape poets, but the way they focus the landscape is different. The idea being that generally Meng Haoran's landscapes are more humanized and they have a more explicit human presence. Anyway, so before continuing to talk about Meng Haoran's passing the night on Jiande River, I'll just comment a brief anecdote which I forgot to mention about the previous day's poems, Zhu Yong's Looking at the Snow on South Mountain. The thing I had forgotten to say was that that poem was actually, well, this is what the tradition says at least, that was the poem that he composed for the presented scholar examination for the Jinshi. In that examination, the poem should have had 12 lines, but Zhu Yong was so satisfied with how the poem had coalesced into those four pentasyllabic lines that he refused to continue writing. And when the examinator asked him why he had stopped, he replied, the idea is complete. Allegedly, he was failed because of this. Anyway, so moving again to Meng Haoran's poem. This is, on the face of it, the pretty typical, the pretty conventional landscape poem of the Tang period. It's short. Passing the night on Jiande River. So we might imagine that apart from the description of that landscape in the Jiande River, there will be an element of describing it at night and the feelings associated by it being night and dark. There probably will be an implicit poetic persona speaking the poem who is a traveler who feels melancholy and sad because he is away from home. And this melancholy and sadness will probably be intensified by the landscape he encounters and by the time of day, or rather the time of night, in which the poem is written. Now, Meng Haoran, you all know who he is. We've talked quite a lot of him. He is one of the better represented poets in this anthology with 15 poems. The two that we have here, today's Jiande River one and Next Day Spring Morning, are the last two of them. So, what else can we say? I found one aspect very interesting in this poem that I'll comment in a minute. It reminds me of a very famous poem we've also encountered in this anthology by Li Bai, in which she is drunk and talking to the moon and his shadow. In this poem, you also have that element of the closeness to the moon, who almost becomes a friend or a physical character in the reach of the poetic persona. Okay, so having said that, I think we can go to the poem. First couplet. Anchor the boat in a mist-heavy cove. Day sinks into dusk, sadness rises. So the title of the poem already tells us that we are passing the night on Jiande River. Jiande River was a river in the eastern part of the country, in the territory of Zhejiang, an area of lakes, and the area also where the Yangtze River ends, connecting to the sea, or pretty close. Well, I think it gets to the sea a little bit to the south of Zhejiang, but I'm not absolutely sure. Anyway, it's a watery region full of lakes and rivers, and probably far away from Meng Haoran's home, and definitely from the court. The poetic persona, which we might imagine is Meng Haoran, is a traveler with all the sad, melancholy connotations of a traveler, and he's staying for the night. And we've encountered many poems like this of a poet staying for the night at one place and feeling sad, lonely, forlorn, and all of that. So the poem, the title already tells us about that topic. So the first couplet shows us the stopping and the night coming in. So the first line, anchored the boat in a mist-heavy cove. So the boat in which the poet is traveling anchors, and already at this moment of anchoring, at this mist-heavy cove of the river, we get this slightly unreal, dream-like nature of the place where the boat stops. It's surrounded by mist, so we might imagine that in the declining light of day, as things lose their definite shapes on this cove in the water, all surrounded by mist, all shapes lose their definiteness. Night and mist contribute to a surreal, supernatural, out of the world atmosphere, as if you will, isolating the poet from the other people in the boats, from the shore, from most of the landscape, which, if the mist is dense enough and the night is dark enough, would, become just a pale, dark background. So it all further contributes to an image of the poetic persona in splendid isolation. Second line, day sinks into dusk, sadness rises. I like the contrasting movement. So the day is sinking into dusk, light is going away, darkness is creeping in, but at the same time that the day is sinking, something is rising, the sadness of the poet. Sadness at dusk, as we've said many times, a conventional and unexpected reaction of the poet when night comes. He is far away from home. He feels lonely. Night is the loneliest time of the day. So with incoming night, the poet feels sad, feels more lonely and more isolated from his friends and from the world. So it is appropriate at this time of day to feel sad and melancholy, for sad feelings to arise and maybe to impede sleep and rest for the poetic persona. So the first couplet tells us of the action of the boat stopping, and it tells us of the time, the day sinking, and it also tells us of the mood, of the feeling of sadness that permeates the poet. The second couplet moves in another direction. It's basically a series of, I would say, 1, 2, 3, or 4 images, or 4 juxtaposed images that are the landscape that at that moment of dusk and at night, perhaps extending all through the night, what are the main 4 sights the poet sees, and what might be the implicit feelings that they inspire in him? Might they reinforce the sadness? Might they contrast ironically to it? So we have the following elements. First, in the third line, vast plain, sky touching treetops. So a vast plain can be seen from an extending plain, can be seen from the poet's persona, and also treetops that seem to touch the sky. So these 2 images are pointing, I would say, or at least the impression I get is of an indistinctness between heaven and earth. There's heaven and earth, which are very separate spaces. At night, heaven becomes dark, the plain becomes dark, the shadows of trees raising up seem to be, rising high and being able to touch the heavens. There's this image, there's this feeling of the commingling of things, of the indeterminate mixture of heaven and earth. It all becomes merged into this mass that the poet is contemplated, tied together by those trees that seem to spring from the plains but reach up to all the mountains and reach up into the sky. So that's one side, how the plain in the dusk seems to evaporate, to dissolve itself into a darkness that does not seem at all different from the higher darkness of the heavens, and with both darknesses being connected or being pierced by treetops. Fourth line, clear river, moon floating just out of reach. So we had plain and sky touched treetops in the previous line. So earth and sky. In the next line, we get river and moon. That is water and, you could say, sky again, as the moon is in the heavens. We are next to a river, the Jiande River, so the flowing, shiny water under the moonlight is still seen. The water appears clear, so it's not murky or dark. It seems transparent or crystalline. And on that clear water, the moon is floating. We might imagine it probably refers to the reflection of the moon on the waters. The moon is floating just out of reach. So it's floating in the waters relatively close by to where the poetic persona is gazing at. Or perhaps it's so late that the moon is sinking in the horizon. It seems to be, just above the waters of the river, far away. But anyway, in both cases, the idea is that the moon seems to have come to make company to the poet. It seems just out of reach. If he could extend his hand, he would be able to touch the moon. I think in other versions of this poem, by which I mean other translations, the focus is on the moon is, like a friend that is, almost next to me and giving me company. So, as I said, this image reminded me the familiarity with the moon, as if the moon were a character and an old friend in some of Levi's poems. And I think that's present in this poem by Meng Haoran as well. This idea that the moon is, not just a heavenly body so far away, but, it's the poet's friend, inspirer, and companion, one that could almost be grasped and touched with one's fingertips. So, yeah, I wouldn't be able to say if these images, the merging of heaven and earth with the trees piercing both spaces, the clear waters with the moon as an image or just floating on top of them and almost within reach, I wouldn't be able to say if these images actually emphasize the sadness or go in a different way. They give the typical night landscape. And, they create a background of beauty, of mystery. But, probably they're meant to create a slightly melancholy and sad feeling, acting as a background or as an intensifier, as a resounding box for the poet's sad melancholy, elegant sad melancholy. So I think that's it. So pretty conventional poem with a description of nature. I don't think it's a bad poem. It's pretty straightforward, pretty simple, as most of these pentasyllabic quatrains that we've been reading are showing to be. So just it's sunset. The poet is it's night. The poet is slightly sad and melancholy, and he enjoys these sides of a weird nature that seems to merge heaven and earth and that seems to be in the moon within his grasp.